Alright folks, so today's Saturday session is going to cover maximising marks at Junior Cycle Geography. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session. Today's session is going to be a little bit more interactive than usual. So there's going to be multiple opportunities for you guys to stop. I'll pause the video, I'll put on a timer, and for us to complete exam questions together. So the structure of today's session might differ a little bit than previous sessions. There's going to be lots of opportunity where we'll analyse past exam questions together. I'm going to model or show you what excellence looks like at Junior Cycle Geography, how to maximise your marks and achieve those distinction level marks. And then there's going to be multiple opportunities with success criteria and guided practice to support you guys in actually, improving as Junior Cycle Geographers and actually maximising your marks throughout the session. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for you guys to work, but we're going to complete a lot of that work together as well. Before we get into the depths of things, I'll just introduce myself. So my name's Lee O'Donnell. I work with ExamRevision. I'm a geography, history and politics and society teacher. I also lecture in geography and history in University College Dublin. I also have a Leaving Cert Geography book. It's called The Natural World. I have a Leaving Cert Geography and History revision podcast. It's called Skin in the Game. It's available on Spotify and Apple and Google Podcasts, where you can get podcasts really. And I also work for ExamRevision, so I'm Leaving Cert History and Geography content creator for ExamRevision. I'm feeling really fortunate today to be able to work on the Junior Cycle Geography side of things and work with you guys through today's Saturday session. So first thing that we're going to go through today is the Junior Cycle Geography 2022 exam structure, just to kind of give you an idea of what the exam looks like and how the exam is structured. So the first thing that we'll look at is basically how many questions there were on the paper. So if we look at the Junior Cycle Geography exam in 2022, there were 9 questions on the paper. Students had to answer all 9 questions with no choice, and the questions did not carry equal marks. And what we're going to specifically look at today is how these questions followed a non-linear approach to topics. So what I mean by a non-linear approach is it wasn't very just black and white, that now you're answering rivers, now you're answering economic geography, now you're answering regional geography, now you're answering extreme weather events. Inside and the structure of all the questions, we're going to break that down together. But the structure of the questions allowed the exam to basically, ask questions regarding multiple topics on the same question. So sub-questions inside a main question, say question 8 part A, B and C, could have been from 3 different topics. So that non-linear approach makes it very difficult to just say study rivers, because when the initial question might ask about rivers, the last question or part C on that question could finish up and you could be talking about maps, for an example. So we see lots of different topics jumbled into one question, and it's a non-linear approach, and it makes it very difficult from our perspective to say you need to study this, because all topics are interlinked, and that's what we're going to look at today. To give you some examples of timings for the Junior Cycle Geography exam, there's basically 2 types of scenarios that we have to prepare timings for. If the exam has 9 questions or if the exam has 10 questions. And I only highlight this to you now, guys, because I suppose from a teacher's perspective, the initial exams that were sent out to us by the SEC actually had 10 questions inside the 2 hours. However, adjustments were made to the 2022 exam to accommodate students who had learning disrupted over the course of COVID-19, and 1 question was taken off the exam. So now that makes it difficult from my perspective to give you these are the timings that we need to follow, because there's possibly 2 types of exams that could come up: a 9 question exam and a 10 question exam, and we're going to cover both here today. So if the exam has 9 questions, if the exam has 9 questions, your timing is going to look like this. So if the paper in June has 9 questions, you're going to have approximately 13 minutes per question to answer each question. Now, what's difficult about the exam is that all questions don't carry equal marks. And from what we've seen so far, there's no marks assigned per question on the exam. So we have to make a rough estimate of a guess, and we're going to assign roughly 13 minutes per question to the exam. Some questions you might finish earlier, some questions you might finish later, but that 13-minute mark is going to be your aim if there's 9 overall questions on the exam. And I've kind of put a little kind of disclaimer in here that adjustments may be necessary depending on whether you find a question complex or difficult, your familiarity with the topic. So are you comfortable discussing that topic at length, and then obviously take into account your own pacing. So your own ability to write legibly quickly is going to be taken into account here as well. But as a rough guide, if we have 9 questions on the exam, 13 minutes per question will be a good place to start regarding your timing. If we look at a 10 question exam, the timing is going to change a little bit. So if there's overall 10 questions on the paper, you're going to have approximately 12 minutes per question to answer every single question on the exam. And that might not seem like a lot to you, but those minutes add up over the course of 2 hours, especially in that kind of time sensitive and pressurized environment that is a junior cycle geography exam. Once again, when you're taking those timings into consideration, you need to consider, is the question complex or difficult? Are you comfortable discussing that topic? Do you have the content knowledge to discuss that? And your own pacing and ability to write at length legibly is going to need to be taken into account there. But the biggest thing we need to factor in is that there's no choice on the exam. All questions don't carry equal marks. And depending on how many questions come up on the exam, if it's 9, you've got 13 minutes. 9 equals 13 mins. And if it's 10 questions, you've got 12 mins per question, and that's going to be a good basis to start your timing. Some questions you might finish in 6-7 minutes. Don't think that you have that time spare, because some questions might take you 15, 16, even 17 minutes, because some questions have more parts than the other. We're going to look at lots of questions here today, so you're going to see that in action, but I just wanted to highlight that to you now. So if we look at the typical structure of exam questions at junior cycle geography, this is something for your that's I suppose beneficial for you guys to be aware of. I suppose the structure of the questions doesn't really differ. It follows a very similar structure. The length of each question differs, I suppose. So one question might have part A 1, 2 and 3, part B 1, while other questions might have in part A, B and C might have part 4, 5 and 6 as part of it as well. So question 1 and question 2 could be completely different lengths, but if you break it down as a whole or as an individual question, the structure of those exam questions are fairly similar. The first thing that you're going to see as part of your exam paper, or as part of an exam question in junior cycle geography, you're going to be given a piece of source. You're going to be given a source or a piece of stimulus. That stimulus could be a graph, it could be a diagram, it could be a newspaper article, it could be anything that's linked to a topic that you've studied at junior cycle geography. So when we look at a couple of questions now as we progress throughout the session, what we're going to see is some questions might have, if we're studying rivers, it might have a newspaper article about river flooding as its source or stimulus to kind of guide students into the topic that they're going to be studying. After you see your source or piece of stimulus, you're going to be given a comprehension question. So those comprehension questions generally or are there to basically assess your comprehension or understanding of the source or stimulus. So those comprehension questions are sometimes tied or connected with a connection question. I call it a connection question because it connects the source or stimulus that you're looking at, the picture, diagram, newspaper article, to the content that you've studied in your junior cycle geography classroom. So it's connecting that piece of source and stimulus, and it's also it's often quite, the gap is bridged by that kind of comprehension style question. After we get a connection question, we usually have a knowledge question, and those knowledge questions can come at different lengths. There could be 4, 5, 6 knowledge questions, there could be 1 knowledge question, but these knowledge questions are directly testing your knowledge. Although they might be related to the source or stimulus, there's a good chance that they won't be as well, because remember what we talked about, the questions like to follow this non-linear approach to answering questions. So even if your source or stimulus is about rivers, your last knowledge question could be about OS maps, because the exam is structured in a way that it's not just one question or one topic is assigned to one question. We've got multiple different topics and multiple different areas of geography assigned to each question. So it's quite often we might see, if I just rub this out and I'll go on this side, if it's going to work for me. No, my rubber doesn't see. Oh, there we go. Always when you least expect it. Anyway, so if we were talking about the source or stimulus is about rivers, You're going to have a comprehension and connection question. So it might be a diagram of a waterfall, and you might be asked to identify the plunge pool and label 3 extra parts of the diagram. So let's say our comprehension and connection questions are about labeling the diagram. Then your next knowledge question, or your first knowledge question, might be about the formation of waterfalls. So it might be to explain the processes of erosion that work at as a waterfall forms, or explain how a waterfall forms. So we'll put that down. Explain waterfall formation. Then your next knowledge-based question might be an OS map picture. You might have to correctly identify a waterfall on the OS map. And then your last knowledge-based question might be around economic impacts of flooding, or the positive benefits of hydroelectricity, or something along those lines. So let's say we just write hydro down, hydroelectricity. And you're going to see this in multiple examples now, but what we see happen as we progress down the questions, then we see that non-linear approach, that although the source or stimulus started with rivers, by the end we're talking about renewable energy sources. And it's just something to be aware of as a student, that and it's something just to be mindful of in your own planning, that just studying topics by themselves isn't going to directly benefit you in terms of the geography exam. We need to be able to understand and connect the different topics together, because that's the overarching goal of being a geography student. Okay, so if we have a look at one of these questions now, you'll see you're given a source or stimulus. You've got a photograph or an aerial photograph here that you're being asked to correctly identify the labels. Then the second question there, you can see it's a connection-based question. It's based on coastal tourism, so completely different to, I suppose, the physical geography features that you're labeling there. Then you've got a question that asks you to explain the process of longshore drift, and then by the end of the question here, you've got an OS map question where you're being asked to apply those skills. So you've got Rosslare Harbour, a coastal area. You have to draw a sketch map on that. You have to measure straight line distances, and then by the end of the question there, it was looking to identify the functions of the town on the OS map as well. So we can see how that non-linear approach is evident in action there, and we're going to look at multiple examples of that as we progress. Next thing I just want to highlight to you guys is the junior cycle marking scheme, because it's something that you mightn't have talked about before, or you might have no knowledge about. And it's a really important document because it tells us loads, it tells me loads as a junior cycle geography teacher, but for students it tells you more than you'd realize as well. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to kind of break down the junior cycle geography marking scheme here. We're going to explicitly cover what it means for you as a student, and then we're going to look to apply all of that knowledge in an exam situation. So if we have a look at the marking scheme together, the junior cycle marking scheme it's only new. I do expect it to change from last year. I do expect it to change from year to year, because something you might not be aware of, but junior cycle geography exam is only new. It's only got a couple of, I suppose, cycles of actually being used, and teachers and the SEC who sets the exam are still learning and still making changes to the program as they go. So I do expect the marking scheme to change. However, I don't expect it to change drastically. What we're going to do is we're going to explore the most common marks awarded from the marking scheme, and then we're going to focus on how we can achieve those marks in our own practice. So the most common marks awarded from the junior cycle geography marking scheme was for naming a process, landform, or impact. Students were assigned 2 marks. So the ability to successfully and correctly name a process, landform, or impact from knowledge would usually gain students 2 marks. The second, the probably most important types of marks we're going to look at are these valid point marks. So the first one is a valid point. So they're called VP2 marks on the marking scheme. They were awarded for 2 marks. So valid point marks were usually awarded if a question asked a student to name and explain one process of erosion along a river's journey. So a student would have got 2 marks for naming that process, let's say hydraulic action, and then a VP2 mark, a valid point mark, for explaining the process of hydraulic action. So it's the force of water breaking down rock. The third type of mark that was available to students is called a VP3. So it was a valid point explained mark. So those VP3 marks were usually for I'm going to call it like a third tier piece of knowledge, so a third sentence. So you were to name a process, landform, or impact. So let's say hydraulic action. You gave a valid point of explaining what hydraulic action was. So hydraulic action is the force of water breaking down rock. And then a valid point explained was, you could say hydraulic action is a dominant process in the formation of waterfalls, as vertical erosion causes a step-like feature to form along an area where there's hard and soft rock meets. That would have been your valid point explained to get those higher kind of 3-tier marks. So what we often see with the the marking scheme and the style of how questions are asked in junior cycle geography, students needed to be able to get to this point themselves. So even if the question said name and explain, and let's say for example a student just went hydraulic action is a process of river erosion, it's the force of water breaking down rocks. Let's say the question was worth 7 marks. If a student only got to that point, they would have got their named process, their VP2, and they would have got 4 out of 7. So just over 50% of that mark, even though that student was definitely capable of getting to that 7-point mark. So that 7 mark, or this VP3, was that higher tier mark, third tier mark that most students struggle to achieve in the exam. So what we need to be aware of is when we're writing our answers, that we need to fully develop everything that we say. And when we're writing our answers, I'm going to get to this now, we need to be writing short, sharp, concise sentences, and we need to be writing in bunches of sentences, not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences to be achieving those 7. And quite often you might have got a question that was worth 9 marks. So it would have been name, 2 valid points, and a valid point explained to get your 9 marks. Other types of questions that came up, so evidence referred to. So if you were given an OS map and you had to explain why a factory located in a certain location along or in that aerial photograph or OS map, you would have got 2 marks for naming the location, 2 marks for a valid point, and then you would have got a further 2 marks for evidence referred to from the OS map or the aerial photograph. So for example, by saying the right background or of the aerial photograph or along those lines. At times there was also 2 marks available for a valid diagram. However, if there wasn't specifically a valid diagram mark available in the marking scheme, sometimes that valid diagram would be counted as a valid point 2 marks. So your diagrams, more often or not, for 99% of the questions that I've seen so far, were worth 2 marks as well. Something to be aware of, that the diagram, you could spend 10 minutes on a diagram quite easily, and it might only be worth 2 marks towards your final answer. So being sharp, concise, and quick with your diagrams, quick, neat, labeled, colored diagrams are what's going to efficiently pick you up marks as we progress. The last type of mark that was available was an example provided, and this is all hugely valuable information for us for me as your geography teacher, and for us as junior cycle geography students, because this information tells us the type of answers that we need to be writing at junior cycle geography. So although that might seem like a lot of information for you guys now, what we're going to do is break that down into more kind of student friendly language. So the most common marks awarded are important because it gives us lots of information. Firstly, it tells us how to structure our answers. We need to name a process, landform, or feature. We need to explain, so a VP2, valid explanation or a valid point. We need to give a valid point about that process, feature, or landform. VP3, then we need to give a valid explanation. So we need to explain and elaborate to bring that to a higher level. And then if you think about further down the marking scheme, we had evidence referred to, full marks. So refer to a diagram, aerial photograph, OS map. Example given, 2 marks. So if we're talking about formation of a waterfall, Powerscourt waterfall in County Wicklow might be your example there that you pick up 2 marks. And there was also 2 marks available for diagrams at certain points along the exam as well. It also tells us what types of sentences to write. So we need to write short, sharp, concise sentences in junior cycle geography. The sentences can't contain, I'm going to use not a very fancy word here, but it's a word I like to use with my students in the classroom. The sentences can't contain waffle. It can't contain information that's not valid and necessary to quickly answer the question that's been asked, because we're not given much space to write in the exam. So our sentences need to be short, sharp, and concise. concise means straight to the point. So there's no time. I'm going to use that word again, waffle in our sentences. The marking scheme also gives us a guide to how long our answer should be, so it gives us how many marks are assigned to each question. Now, what I don't like about the junior cycle geography exam is that you're just given, let's say a question might give you 16 lines to answer. That's generally a guide of how long your answer should be. So if you're given 16 lines, you need to fill 16 lines, and we also need to write really small in those lines to be picking up those higher marks. If the question's worth 9 marks and you're given 6 lines to write it, you need to write lots of information into that box. It also tells us what type of information we need in our answers. We need to name processes, landforms, or features. We need to give valid points about that, explain them, give examples, evidence referred to, and we need to include diagrams in our answers as well. So all of those kind of core aspects of junior cycle geography that your teachers would have been covering with you are going to be really important when we're looking at that marking scheme. So now, using the marking scheme, it also tells us that we need to write short, sharp, concise sentences. I've talked about that extensively now. We also need to fully develop and explain our answers. This means we need to provide more information than you probably think is necessary. So never stop. If you've got 4 lines left in a box, you need to fill that box. Stop, think to yourself, what does this mean? This means that these are kind of sentences we'll work on together to look to improve how we actually fully develop and explain our answers. We also need to be able to provide evidence to support our answers, whether that be data, statistics, and facts to support what we're writing. So that's something that we need to work on as well. So good geographical writing contains fully developed answers, and it refers reference to data. So data, statistics, and facts to support our answers. That's going to be important. It also tells us when space is provided, we need to draw diagrams, and there's quite often or not, there is space provided in the exam to draw diagrams. And when asked to use a map, aerial photograph, or a piece of stimulus, we need to refer to it and use it in our answers. There are evidence referred to marks, and they were quite often worth 2 marks out of like a 9-mark answer. So you're dropping 1/5 of your marks, give or take, for not making reference to the map, aerial photograph, or stimulus. So we need to be referring to the evidence. It also tells us that we must write small in order to achieve full marks in geography. We need to be aiming for 10 to 12 words per line. And that's a big change from, I suppose, that can be a very difficult change more often or not, because, you know, we could write large in our copybooks. We all have different handwriting styles, but the nature of the junior cycle geography exam, we're only given a certain amount of space to write our answers. We need to write small, 10 to 12 words per line, and squeeze that as much information in as possible. That's if we're aiming for our distinction level marks, which is our 90 to 100% bracket, and that's where I'd like all students to be. Okay, what we're going to start to look at now is questions from the exam. So at this point, I know you've been listening to me for a long time, and I've talked about how this session is going to be a little bit more interactive. But if you are kind of zoned out, I know what it can be like to listen to someone for a long period of time. I'm going to ask you to put your pens, pencils down. And what we're going to do is look at the structure of question 1 together. So we're going to see and apply all that information regarding the marking scheme that we've talked about. So we're going to look at question 1, and we're going to look at how I write an answer to that question. So I suppose one of our knowledge-based questions from question 1 on the junior cycle geography exam was the question that you can see up here. So I'll direct your attention there, and I'll give you 1 second just to read that question for me. Okay, so let's have a look at the breakdown of that question together. So the question asks us to name and explain one process of mechanical weathering that you've studied by using a label diagram to illustrate your answer. So if we break down what that question's actually asking us, we have to name and explain. The question asking us around mechanical or or physical weathering. We have to use a label diagram to support our answer. What that means is we need to name one type of mechanical weathering. That's going to most likely be worth 2 marks, as we know. And we need to provide a clear and detailed information on one type of mechanical weathering. We need to explain step by step how that type of mechanical weathering occurs. The type of mechanical weathering most people will talk about here, freestyle action. Maybe some people are regarding, or we'll discuss exfoliation. So if we have a look at the marking scheme for this question here, so valid process name would have got a student 2 marks. 5 valid points would have been worth 10 marks, so each valid point would have been worth 2 marks each, and then there was 2 marks available for a diagram for a total of 14 marks. So what that marking scheme tells us here, you would have got 2 marks for naming your process. Let's say we write freeze thaw here. Then in our explanation, we needed 5 valid points. So we needed 5 sentences that gave new information in each sentence. Those 5 valid points could include an example inside of that. So we needed 4 points to explain freeze thaw and an example. And then we needed to draw a label diagram down here. So like if we quickly draw our, our freeze thaw diagram, it would have looked something along those lines. And at the end of the diagram, we would have had something like this. And we're going to look at all that now together. But that's what we were looking for our answer. So what we're going to do is now have a look at a sample answer together, and then we're going to look to write our own sample answer afterwards. So just think about that marking scheme in your head. First thing we need to do is name a process of mechanical weathering. So one process of mechanical weathering that I have studied is freeze thaw action, also known as frost weathering. Okay, we would have got 2 marks. This process occurs in regions with fluctuating temperatures like Ireland, where freezing and thawing cycles are common. Okay, there's another 2 marks out of 14. Remember, we're looking for 14 here. So now we need to give 4 or 5 more valid points. So during freeze thaw action, water enters cracks and joints in rocks. When the temperature drops below freezing point, the water freezes and expands, exerting pressure on the surrounding rock material. 2 marks. This expansion creates stress within the rock, causing it to weaken and eventually fracture. 2 marks. When the temperature rises above freezing point and the ice melts, the water seeps deeper into the cracks. This cycle repeats, widening the cracks further, facilitating the breakdown of rock over time. If we flick to the next section then, I give an example of where this can occur. So an example of freeze thaw action in Ireland can be observed in the Burren of County Clare. I talk about freeze thaw action there because of the clints and grikes in the Burren. And if you remember the last part of that question, we needed a diagram here. So if we total up our marks for our total marks for that question, we got 2 for naming, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 we got for our valid points. So we got 6 valid points, we only need 5. So this one here, I'm going to call that a surplus mark. So we gave probably a little bit too much information. And then we got our 2 marks for our diagram for a total of 14 out of 14 marks. So what you'll see about this answer that we've talked about is how we've used short, sharp, concise sentences. We've made sure to constantly fully develop our sentences and our ideas by writing more sentences, by using phrases like this means that, and thinking about, okay, what happens next? What does this mean? So if we focus in up here for a second. Okay, during freeze thaw action, water enters cracks and joints in rocks. Okay, I'm here. Okay, what happens next? What happens when that water enters cracks and joints in rock? Oh yeah, temperatures drop, water freezes, expands. Okay, excellent stuff. What happens when it expands? It exerts pressure. Okay, what happens when that exerts pressure? Stress causes the rock to weaken. It'll eventually fracture. And we go through that thought process there, looking to constantly fully develop and expand on our points. So now that you've seen the sample answer for freeze thaw action, what I'm going to ask you to do now is to have a go at attempting that question. Now, I'm not going to ask you to attempt that question by yourself. I'm going to give you a set of success criteria to answer that question after seeing my sample answer. What's really important now is, though, that you don't kind of, lie or lie to yourself or cheat in the sense that you just look back at my sample answer and write out the correct or copy out word for word my sample answer. That wouldn't be the best practice. That isn't the best use of your time. The best use of your time now is to use the success criteria that I give you to think about the correct answer and to create your own answer and then self-assess your answer against my answer towards the end. So what we're going to look at next basically is writing your answer into your copybooks. You're going to answer the question on the next slide. That says Zoom. That should be in your copy. You're going to answer the question on the next slide and you're going to use the success criteria to guide your answer. So let's go through that question again. So if we look at the question, we have to name and explain one process of mechanical weathering that you've studied, and if you use a labeled diagram to illustrate your answer. So in order to answer that correctly and reach full marks, there's a couple of things that you must do. Firstly, you must name the process of mechanical weathering, such as freeze thaw action if you choose to answer about that. Second thing you need to do is explain that freeze thaw action occurs in regions with fluctuating temperatures like Ireland, where freezing and thawing cycles are common. Third thing you must do is describe how water enters cracks and joints in rocks When it freezes, it expands, exerts pressure on the surrounding rock material, leading to stress, weakening, and eventually fracturing of the rock. A couple of things you should do in your answer is provide an example of where it occurs in Ireland, such as the Burren. Explain why the Burren's landscape is susceptible or why it's common for freeze-thaw action to occur there. And you could discuss how frequent cycles of freezing and thawing in the Burren region result in the formation of grikes and clints and gives it that unique landscape that we talk about. Finally, your answer could draw a diagram to represent the process of freeze-thaw action. So what I'm going to do now is put a timer on the clock. You're going to put a timer for, let's say, 8 minutes. You've got 8 minutes to use the success criteria and write an answer to explaining the process of mechanical weathering into your copybooks now. So as I said, the most beneficial thing that you could do now is just leave the video play, 8 minutes on the clock, and you're going to time yourself as you answer that question into your copybooks now. So I'm going to put the timer up. I'm going to put 08. No. I'm going to put 8 minutes on the clock. I'm going to move this out of the way of the success criteria, and you're going to write that answer into your copybooks now, trying your best to think back to the sample answer and use that as a guide to support your understanding. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and we're off. Okay, last 30 seconds, guys. Brilliant stuff, folks. So hopefully we've all answered that question inside the 10 minutes there. 10 minutes is probably more time than you'd have in an exam situation to answer that style of question. And hopefully after having a look at that exam question and marking scheme and a sample answer beforehand, most of us are up to the point where our answers are looking like this. So at this point, if you need to, I'll ask you to stop and pause the video here, and you can just go back and actually watch or self-assess your sample answer or my sample answer against your answer to ensure that we're achieving full marks in that answer as we go. So we'll do one more question as part of this kind of session, and it's something that we'll elaborate on across the year. So I'm going to get you to put your pens, pencils down and everything and just kind of focus in with me for 2 more minutes while we have a look at a breakdown of a knowledge-based question from question 2 on a 2022 exam paper. So we're going to have a look at the structure of the question together. So if I show you that question, the first things that was shown to students was this aerial photograph. So the aerial photograph highlighted point X, and the question asked students to explain 2 reasons why the area marked X would be a good location for a factory, using evidence from the photograph to support your reason. So we're going to come back to that kind of breakdown of the question in 1 second. But before we look at the marking scheme and the breakdown of that question, I'd like you to just give you 10 seconds just to take in the aerial photograph that you see on the board or on the screen right now. And what you should be doing while you're taking that in is just trying to identify 2 reasons why location X might be a good location for a factory. Okay, so if I'm looking at this, we can identify lots of different reasons why this might be a good location for a factory to set up. If I was to identify, probably the 2 most prominent to me would be its proximity to local town or residential area. Its proximity to the town or the residential area there is going to provide a labour force, or I'm going to say large labour force, but probably just a labour force to actually work in the factory. And if I was to identify a second reason, the second reason I'm going to identify is transport infrastructure. So the factory is located on the outskirts of the town with access to good transport infrastructure, such as what looks to be maybe a national road there, maybe not a motorway, but a national road, and it also has access to Rosslare Harbour there, where the export of goods could take place via that way. So if we have a look at the question here together, we have to explain 2 reasons why the area marked X would be a good location for a factory. Most importantly, we have to use evidence from the photograph to support each reason. So if we look at a breakdown from that question, what it's asked us to do is provide clear and detailed information on why it's a good location for a factory, and we must use evidence from the photograph. It literally tells us that we're going to lose marks if we don't. Let's have a look at the marking scheme, and does it kind of match up to what our thought process has been so far. So 2 reasons explained were worth 7 marks each, so the total question here was worth 14 marks. So for each reason, you needed to name the reason, give 1 valid point of explanation, and 1 piece of evidence referred to. So you got 2 marks for naming your reason, such as good access to good transport infrastructure, 3 marks for a valid explanation of VP3. So we had to explain examples of that transport infrastructure. So access to the national road and the port infrastructure would allow the ease of transport of goods. It would ensure that goods that were produced in the factory made it to market quickly and efficiently. Would have got you 3 marks. And then lastly, the sneaker marks, I'm going to call them EV2. So we had to give evidence from the aerial photograph to support that. So we would have had to use phrases like, in the center ground of the aerial photograph, we can see access to a national road would have made it easy to transport goods. Then it gives us reasons that could include you were near housing estates, access to roads, space to expand, and it specifically says do not accept oblique locations for the evidence mark. So if we have a look at our sample answer here, we're going to read through it together and then we're going to get working around that together afterwards. So firstly, the area marked X is near housing estates. This is beneficial for a factory because it provides a potential labour force in close proximity. Workers residing in the nearby housing estates would have easy access to the factory, minimising commuting time and costs. Additionally, having a local workforce can contribute to communities' economic development and create employment opportunities. Second reason we had to give, evidence from the photograph supports this reason. In the background of the image, there are several residential buildings suggesting the presence of housing estates nearby. This indicates the availability of potential workers living in the vicinity of the factory located. So what we would have seen here is our name mark, our valid explanation, and then we would have got our evidence referred to marks. And if we look for our second one, secondly, the area marked X has good access to roads. This is advantageous for a factory as it facilitates the transportation of raw materials and finished products. With easy road access, suppliers can deliver materials to the factory efficiently and the factory can distribute its products to customers in a timely manner. So if we have a look at a breakdown of this marks here, we would have got 2 marks for our named reason why it's a good factory. We would have got 3 marks for our VP3 or valid point explained, and then we would have got our next 2 marks, our EV2 marks, so evidence referred to. Evidence from the photograph can support this reason as well. In the background of the image, there's a well-maintained road visible, providing clear indication of good road connectivity in the area. It provides smooth transportation logistics for the factory. As a result of that breakdown of marks, if you look at that in its totality, we would have got our 14 out of 14 as a result of following the marking scheme: name, valid point explained, and then evidence referred to in the aerial photograph. So what I'm going to do next is going to get you guys to practice an exam question based on a similar or the exact same question after seeing my sample answer. So you're going to write your answer into your copybook again. You're going to answer the question on the next slide using the success criteria as your guide. So let's have a look at the success criteria that will help you answer this. So what your answer must do is clearly state 2 reasons why the area marked would be a good location for a factory. You could use my reasons: location or next to residential area and good road transport infrastructure. Provide evidence to support each reason, and you should use a geographic writing style and language: short, sharp and concise sentences in order to fill. We only had 16 lines there to fill to pick up our 14 marks. We need to be picking up almost a mark per line. What we could also do then is explain that the proximity of the area to housing estates is beneficial for the factory and explain why. Describe how the presence can contribute to the community's economic development and create employment opportunities. And what we should do is refer to the photograph, so pointing out the residential buildings close to the factory. What you should do then as well is talk about the good road access, facilitating the transportation of raw materials, explain how it enables the efficient delivery of materials, and use the photograph as evidence as well. So we're going to go through the same structure again. I am going to put the timer on the clock now. I'm going to put 8 minutes again, and then we're going to finish up for the day. You've got your success criteria in the box here. You can use my sample answer as a guide, but don't cheat yourself and go back and watch it. The most beneficial thing that you could do right now is actually think about your answer by using the success criteria on the screen. So I'm going to start the timer now. You've got 8 minutes, and then we're going to finish up for the day. And 3, 2, 1, and go. So you're just about halfway through the question. Last 30 seconds, folks. And that's us, folks. That's 8 minutes up there, and hopefully everyone got to as close to the end of that question as possible, and you were able to self-assess that and go back and compare it against the sample answer that was provided. That's the end of our Saturday session today, folks. I want to say thank you to everyone for their time over the course of the session. And what you'll find over the course of the next year is multiple different sessions now, and almost a continuation of sessions where you'll see multiple opportunities for you guys to use the skills that you develop over the course of the session and apply that to exam questions. So what we're going to develop over the course of the year is the ability to adapt and the ability to apply marking schemes and understand how we should structure our answers in junior cycle geography to maximize the amount of marks that we can receive. So although this is the first session and it might seem a little bit overwhelming, stick with it over the course of the year, and what you're going to see happen is your ability to maximize your marks improve. Just want to say thanks again, folks, and I'll speak to you soon.